Mhm.
Bueno,
Mhm.
y
So,
ja,
yes,
we have better doing.
yeah. So we are now in our third session.
Session, yeah, third season, third session, because it's third season of the year right now.
Yes. So in our first and second session, we start to talk about this idea of how to deindustrialize ourselves. And during our first meeting, we start to exchange different experiences, actually from our different countries, about if it's really possible to do it. Um, but no just in the economical way, also in our cultural, let's say, field, because also this is a very important note that personally, at least, I talk as an artist and I don't talk as an anthropologist. And so even if exists, of course, a kind of very clear definition about what is the industrialization, my interest is more focused about to thinking in a more artistical way, let's say, or how affect our artistic practices, but also as a concept, as a problem, like after, I don't know, 200 years of particular here around production and so on, how we can deal with this kind of reality with in this kind of system, and how this system affect all our life, and because affect our life, how affect our practices in general. And in the second session, who was last week, we start to talk also about which words or which concepts we start to use, or when we discuss about this the industrialization phenomenon. And I present 5 glossaries, um, and in each glossaries we somehow exchange different experiences about how we can create together in a collective way different kind of grammar, or different kinds of discourse event, when we talk about contemporary art, and in this kind of huge contradictions of I don't know, aspects. Because also this was a very interesting point last week, is somehow how we are in a kind of huge contradiction constantly, like even if we have a kind of um, very clear plan, or even very clear kind of alternative, how especially in contemporary art, how we have to negotiate constantly with conditions of work, conditions of life, certain sometimes emergencies, and also the conditions of the political conditions constantly change and so on. So we have to constantly modify the strategy. And even sometimes when we feel very, very like, okay, we build this alternative, then we realize that the institutions already start to learn about that, and they start to institutionalize some words, some concepts, some practices, and then we are again in a frame, and we have to move inside that frame again in order to escape or find other alternatives. So today we are in another kind of frame. Let's say it's about creative industries, and the idea is again to talk about that, but not in an illustrative way. It's also about again a kind of also imaginary, I don't know, we could talk also in a kind of metaphorical way about cultural industries or creative industries. And now Helen and me, the idea is to have a kind of a short conversation about that, and then we can share some thoughts. And next week we have our final meeting. And the idea is during the final meeting, really try to put everything together and try to really see and read again, and I don't know, to really talking and exchange about this invitation about how to deindustrialize ourselves. So yes, so let's start. um, I before, actually, when I prepared this lecture today, actually I thinking like how we can really talk from our experience. So I think would be interesting to think in also the art department as a project, so we can play in that frame. Actually, because when we talk about cultural or creative industries, I like the idea that it's not just a kind of, let's say, very clear, let's say, a structure, have many parts, many dimensions, and it's super rich actually. And actually, I think somehow already people who are part of art or cinema or even music and other fields, it's very clear that we have to deal constantly with projects.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the idea of projects, I think, is the most clear example about how we industrialize somehow our practice, because I feel, this is a very personal opinion, that actually projects is the most, let's say, important piece for art piece, let's say, or art object for art, because if we read the project as an artwork, it's really clear, like, have different parts and it's never ending, and it's a kind of intangible, immaterial. It's always a project, because also the art became a project. Constantly we talk also work in progress or ongoing, and somehow this kind of form is very, I think, very successful, because it's never ending actually. But also these kind of projects have different dimensions, like first of all have a title, and then have objectives, and also have a kind of program or cartagan, when you organize in months any activities and so on. And even sometimes you have to add a CV and a dossier, and then somehow we can find in internet many examples about how to make a successful CV, a successful dossier, portfolio. And somehow I think this is a very creative industry, actually, like how everyone became a kind of very clear, I don't know, model of a little small business, or we constantly apply with open course and so on. So I say all these things in order to put everything on the table, and then we can start to exchange. So I think we can talk about the art department in that frame, for example, about this project, this seminar, or also we can talk about your experience about these creative industries, if you want to.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's interesting because, like, we were just talking about this before we like switched on the recording, about like what GCAS is, and if GCAS is any different to, because we're trying to create a space where it's just like we come, we chat, we exchange ideas, and maybe this raises some level of issues in our minds that we can carry out in our practice the rest of the week. But at the same time, like with everything, it's time that you're giving, is the person giving the lecture, that Pantra and I are giving, is setting up, and as hopefully more people if they get involved. And this is, unless it's paid, like volunteer work, because at a certain level, when work is being done, even though one is enjoying one's work, there's certain value that's generated. And the value, but I guess this is the thing in the arts, right, that I find really interesting. It's like, where does the value go? Because every time we do, we sacrifice, we take time, we go through the difficult work of improving ourselves in terms of our artistic practices, or we make work or a project, there's a certain value being generated. And it might not be like, but people might be like, oh, well, this piece of work that you've done doesn't merit being paid for because it's not valuable on the market. But the object that is valuable on the market is only valuable because of the labor that everybody else has put in. So I often think of film festivals, because, you know, we're talking about, I think you mentioned in like the plan for this session about competition, because arts, because it isn't just like a salaried thing in a usual way, and people might think it operates differently from the market system, but it's actually hyper-capitalist, hyper-capitalist, precisely because people might think it's, oh, it's not as capitalist because people aren't getting salaries and it's not like structured or whatever. But actually, it's even more exploitative precisely because it's not doing that. So I always think about as well, like people, ideologically, we think that the person who wins like the gold medal in the Olympics, they win that gold medal because they've succeeded, they've sacrificed so much, they've put in 10,000 hours of training, and they're really good. And that's why they get so much money, and that's what that gold medal represents, is all the sacrifice that they've made. No. The value of the gold medal is all of the hundreds of thousands of people who've tried and failed. That's what makes it valuable. And this person, the cover story, the capitalist cover story, is like this individual person has made all the sacrifice. You might read their autobiography and it's like, I started training at 5 years old and I trained every afternoon until I was 25. But it's like, that's not, and then I broke my leg and I was so committed. But the value is the fact that everybody else is trying but failing. So in art, it's the same way. Like one picture is worth so much precisely because, let's say, you know, an object or whatever, because so many people are trying to do it. And so but this is where I guess this isn't to do with, like, I don't like the term consciousness raising. I think this is an unconsciousness raising thing, and the capitalist unconscious, like the thing that cuts across capitalism that we try to repress, is the extraction of surplus value by those who own the means of production. And what we're always invited to do under capitalism is to misrecognize where this surplus value, A, that surplus value exists, or B, where it's taking place in our economy. And the fourth industrial revolution with tech was such a good example of this. It was like, Uber's different because it's creating so much value and it's making everyone's lives easy. But actually what was going on in terms of surplus value, that was not that surplus value was being generated because something productive was being made, and then the bosses of Uber were extracting some productivity that had been generated. It was precisely fucking up the whole system to ensure that there was no one else to extract surplus value. So the key is to really understand where the surplus value is. And so just to finish this point, because this is in film and I just find it really interesting, is the festival industrial complex. And I'm sure, like with art, there's this thing with open calls and stuff, because what happens is every time you open so you think of something like Sundance, well, most of the slots in Sundance are already selected anyway, so you've not got a chance. But basically you pay as the artist, say $100 to have your film viewed, and there's a very small chance that it's actually going to get watched properly, because it's impossible for these few people, because this is not the fault of the people who run like a festival like Sundance, this is the whole structural system. And the people who run Sundance, for example, are also victims of the system. And this is the great thing about capitalism, is you can't pinpoint who the problem is. You know, it's the problem is so unconscious, you know. So basically, and I think the key is to get us all to realize what the capitalist unconscious is. So you pay as a producer, you pay $100 to have the privilege of your film being viewed, and there are 100,000 other people. And then the value is extracted by those few fortunate films who already have been chosen because of their access to fame and prestige already. But this endows those projects with value so that they have value in the market and they can sell for more money, whatever. But basically, so not only that, so you're paying as the applier for the running of the festival, for the events that those people attend, who probably don't even have to pay for the entrance fee at all, but you pay for the promise of the potential, like the 1 in a million chance. And that's really what the toxicity of capitalism is. Then not only that, but the cultural value of all the products that's being generated is paid for by you with your labor in terms of the film that you've made. So the reason why a festival is prestigious is cultural capital. But the cultural capital operates just like actual capital, in that it involves a huge amount of sacrifice appropriated by a small number of people. So you have, let's say, 100,000 films being made with the aspiration of getting into Sundance. Then you pay for, because this is all obfuscated, you don't realize that to pay for the privilege of being viewed it seems logical, not ridiculous. And then you raise the money for your project, you generate the product itself, which is thousands of hours of labor and sometimes millions of pounds, and then you pay to have the chance in a competition format to have your film probably not even properly watched, because it's the people who also are manning this or running the system also are precarious and are subject to the same unfairnesses of the system. But when you really realize it like that, in that kind of capitalistic terms, it's all fucking ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And when you think of the right way to go about doing this and participating in the system, it's actually almost impossible, as in you're guaranteeing your sort of artistic slavery by participating. But then what do you do? Is there any alternative? Probably not. I don't know. But it's when you start thinking about these things in market terms, because I guess you were talking about like calls for applications. That's another thing where I'm sure the people who are, it's not the fault of the people who are assessing the applications. They're subject to exactly the same forces, and those jobs are very difficult and competitive. When I think about friends in academia, for instance, those jobs are like horribly competitive to get into, and they're only prestigious insofar as 1 in 1,000 people gets the job. So this is not to complain about those, but it's all predicated on the fact that one person gets a grant and nobody else does. That's what makes it valuable. And it's when it's seen in that kind of like competitive terms, it's quite horrible, really.
It is. It is. I think that, as you say, the competition is the most terrible thing in terms of because it's really about you, especially in these international open calls, and for example, in visual art, also they exist a kind of festivals, but residencies, for example, is a kind of very, very important thing in the last 10 years, maybe. And it's the same thing, like you can even find in Instagram or in different kind of, I don't know, even you can receive emails about that, how every month is a lot of residencies around the world, and some residencies are really about research, some of them is really about promise you, I don't know, a kind of very nice landscape, or some of them are in the city, but also show how is this lack of first to really explore something outside your country or outside your context, or in the other hand, it's really about to have a kind of new experience in another place and so on. But again, this idea of competition, to have to apply, some of them you have to pay a fee just for apply, and you don't know if you will get it or not. So it's really a kind of, as you say, it's a kind of promise in one hand. It's like you really feel like, okay, I will really try this time. And also how, that's why I mentioned this idea of open calls, because I don't know if what was first, if the art project as a research or as a project transformed this institution to make this kind of formula, or is the opposite right now, this institution start to contaminate the practice of the artist, because somehow now every artist is, I mean, at least I think, I don't want to generalize, but at least many artists know how to do a project right now, and somehow this became a kind of artwork. So it's really about how to make a structure, about, I don't know, how you want to argument, and also about you have some certainly keywords for that, because sometimes you have a project, but you have to change depend the profile of the open call or the institution of the country and so on. So it's really, I don't know, it's super difficult to deal with that, because it's really like you really feel you are in no escape, but on another hand you have to survive. I don't know. It's like, but also see a kind of other paradox. I know in the last years exists a lot of discussion already, like against labor, or at least, but then exists a kind of another way, like to really feel like art is a work. So need to have a kind of conditions. You have rights as a worker and so on. but then became again like a kind of, I don't know, like really part of the system, because I don't know, like you have to deal with this idea to, I don't even standards or prices. Like if you have a painting, have to be in this price, or if you make a contract with a gallery, which I don't know if it's, I don't say if it's good or bad. I just say we're in a kind of constantly contradiction. Yeah,
absolutely. It's interesting. I know, because it's like, but one thing though, that in terms of the open call, that kind of structure, I think it definitely does. And we talked about this the other day in terms of like, you know, we have this sort of like ideologically on one side, let's say pro identity politics, and then, or one kind of identity politics. I mean, capitalism always like encourages this like latching on to identity. And then on the other side, sort of an anti-identity politics, which might be an identity politics in another sort of more right-wing way, or more visibly right-wing way. But obviously when it becomes so competitive and so hooked into this sort of like this promise aspect, where if you go to this residence or if you get this award, then you will have access to this, leads people to make self-sacrifices in order to play a game that must be played in order to access these things. And these things where there's so many people who are applying for them, and there has to be some kind of shorthand or reason, especially when art is so subjective, to select. And then this is where you have, you know, it's almost like when, just as something becomes more and more meritocratic, when things never are really meritocratic under capitalism, there is this sort of hedging of bets against the universality or the fake universality of meritocracy to the particular of identity, and the shorthand of like essentialism according to identity. And so this often leads people out of the real like emancipatory dimension of art, which is to do with sort of maybe more quote unquote, I don't like the word transcendent, but like truly universal or dialectical or contradictory themes, towards auto commodification according to identity criteria. So you might be like myself, I might be tempted to apply to women's only things, or say that as a woman this gives me special insight into some aspect that has been commoditized under capitalism, that women have, you know, a more, you know, when the sort of thing that was going around about women politicians are more like, and this is absolutely, if you look at the history of women in leadership, there's just as more likely to be colonialist right wingers as, you know, anybody else. But this, you might be, or you might lean into, certain autobiographical features, and consciously key into this, which might influence your art in some way. Or you might feel like you need to say something. Not, I think that all art says something, but, you know, maybe the best art does it in sort of an interesting dialectical kind of contradictory way, but to like come down on one side or another of, like, say, a culture war, and to essentially make kind of propaganda. But this is an inevitable result, not of anybody's like ill intentions, but of a competitive structure that relies on promise. And obviously competition and promise go hand in hand, because competition, when there's many people and just one chosen one, gets us to libidinally invest, because we only want what we can't have. And when so much sacrifice has happened and so many people don't have, this leads us to psychically invest in the promise of having, even though we all know that the rich and famous rock star ends up killing themselves on a drug overdose because they're miserable as well, even though they've got their, what do they get in, Grammy Award, I don't know, for instance. So but this particular thing really leads us to commodify ourselves. And the thing that's sad is, like, a lot of the self-commodification that happens now is based on a history of, like, say, civil rights that were really important, which leads to mystify, because we have this sort of history where it's like, well, these were really positive things, but today it's sort of been emptied out and hollowed out into sort of just like a purely neoliberal ideological thing. And it can be really hard to sort of like break away from, but then at the same time, it's like, what are you going to do? This is nobody's fault. And sometimes, I mean, I personally would be guilty of being like, getting annoyed at this process in art, but this is the material conditions that have created this, and what's an artist going to do? But the interesting thing is, like, sometimes maybe it starts off not because it's a material situation has led somebody to self commoditize. So it's not at all conscious. And then sometimes then you have to lean further and further and further into this like identity category that under neoliberalism, if you're this group, then you're this sort of shorthand. If you're on this right side of history, and then this limits your art because you have to keep feeding into this, sort of ideological framework in order to sustain a career. And it's actually like, I mean, but at the same time, maybe the people who do this are fine and happy with it. I don't know. It is interesting. I think that is a result of this really competitive structure, but it's competitive precisely because art has just been turned into like a neoliberal landscape just as much or perhaps even more than anything else.
I see. I also, you mentioned the idea of sacrifice,
which
I think is totally true. Also, it's very far from this idea of messianic artists. So it's really about the sacrifice to really think, like, if I work hard, like if I continue produce and try something, in some point I will have a kind of recognition and so on. And especially, I think also, I don't know, I have this impression that also the art school, but when I say art school, also, I don't know, a school for filmmakers and a school for all kind of art. I think also they don't, I don't know also if they make a kind of statistic, or if we can check a data about how many people also study art. Actually, for example, in Chile, you have to pay actually for a study, and it's very high. You have to pay a lot of money, but then you don't have a job like after finish. And I know in some universities, I don't want to put in balance or compare, but at least if you study free art and then you don't have a job, okay, somehow it's working. But imagine to study 5 years, you pay a lot of money, but then you also don't have a job, and with the promise, like, again, if you work hard, if you know this. And I think also this idea of how the institutions really, at least in academy or institution who promote study art in an academy or in a kind of I don't know if they really have conscious about how much employed or people without job they produce. Like every year they produce a lot of people with this idea of promise.
Surplus labor. I know, and it's interesting because like these, also because the universities become neoliberal, so they're profit-making enterprises who are under the imperative to make money. So of course it's not in their good business. It's not a good business model for them to be honest about how much it actually works. But again, if it actually worked, then maybe they wouldn't exist, because it's only it's only for a lack of knowledge that these things have to sustain themselves. So you keep going back for more degrees. If you actually like had something that gave you the knowledge, you wouldn't have to keep going back for more. But or have to keep training people up because the knowledge would just be passed around or whatever. But and a lot of art, and film is an interesting, which is actually more, there's more money involved in films, but a lot of it is, people like to really come down with rules. So there's all sorts of people who offer courses, and you can go to workshops outside of the university setting which tell you this is the way, this is the secret to structuring a screenplay. But of course, like, there isn't really one. There's sort of maybe like philosophical underpinnings in terms of what each structure generates in terms of content when you go for it, but there's not really like a hard and fast rule. But just anecdotally, I know, like, in the States, a 4-year undergrad film studies course is like $250,000 or something, really, when you have like living expenses and all this kind of stuff. And just anecdotally, a friend of mine who's in his early 50s, he's a film director, and he went to NYU Film School. And this was in, I guess he would have been there in the 90s. So this is before maybe in like the late 80s, early 90s. And this is before, things are just getting worse and worse and worse in terms of cost and neoliberalism and everything like that, and opportunity. So this person's solidly like Gen X. And NYU Film School is one of the most prestigious. So not only, when you apply to a school like this, like, loads of people don't get in. So this generates value in this like first step of getting in. But out of his graduating class, he's the only person still making films. So it's crazy. Even these like extremely prestigious like USC Film School or NYU Film School, very few people are able to make a living, and it's probably for reasons that are nothing to do with going to the film school, you know, various unfair reasons. But yeah, so these institutions, precisely the more precarious those, precisely the fact that there is no promise, there is nothing on the other side, there is no way to kind of like gird your future, to like, there's absolutely no control, that people like try all the more to spend money to have these opportunities. But so the existence of these film schools are precisely a symptom of the fact that the system is the way it is, and like we're totally unlikely to get anywhere or do anything. But I mean, this is the reason why everybody goes to university now, is precisely because university doesn't get you anything, because there's no job, so you have to spend time doing something, yeah, and pay for the privilege of doing it. But
it's crazy. I think, I mean, for example, personally, I built on my career to study a bachelor and then a master, but for me, was always the opportunity just for actually to meet people,
yeah,
and talk. But I know for some people or academics, it's really about to build a career and building this kind of prestigious. But in the other hand, as you mentioned, could be nice to talk about the difference material about this, because, for example, I like the idea, like you are also from films, and
yeah,
so we can exchange. I am from visual art.
yeah,
So, for example, also about this question about the capitalist aspect of the system in this, for example, at least in visual art, would also the discussion in the materials, like, for example, I will say in this way, maybe it's not the precise way, but also how to make more eco-friendly pieces,
okay,
let's
yeah,
say.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
so the idea of also materialization or intangible or tangible start to become a question. So that's why I say, like, the idea to make more project or the performative aspect to make piece. For example, even people who start to produce engraving or even painting start to ask themselves, but what is the origin of this canvas or this fabric or this oil painting is basically what is really toxic or not. So somehow also is a kind of dimension about the, let's say, the material aspect itself,
yeah.
which is also very interesting, and also reminds me this anecdote right now who came in my mind. This kind of last protest, I think it's in in North Europe, actually, is this kind of activists who bring potato soup, I think, and they just crash on the oil paintings in a kind of protest against that. But also reminds me this kind of contradiction again, like in which, for one hand, about the material aspect, how in film or in cinema at least is reflected this question, but also in the other hand is if the art is still the place where we can make this kind of really protest or let's say to discuss these economical things, but in these terms of material or even institutions.
It's interesting because I was on a podcast the other day and we were discussing this, about this art protest, because almost one of my friends saw it as a symptom of the fact that there used to be defined political places to do protests. For instance, like if you have a job and you go on strike, that has, that disrupts the supply chain. But so many young people don't have jobs, so they can't take action to sort of stand up for things. And a lot of these areas of contestation have reduced and reduced and reduced. So one of the ways that it's been reduced to is for young people, for instance, who maybe are more inclined to like protest about the climate or whatever, in these kind of more cultural spaces, precisely because to draw attention, because and it's not going to disrupt in the same way as maybe like going on strike, but there would be some cultural impact and it gets reported on and what have you. But so the sort of idea that in terms of, maybe not in terms of like the producers of art or whatever, but the protests are happening in different kind of spaces precisely because people don't have the means to have effective political action elsewhere. So yeah, I don't know. But you're talking more about the artists themselves in terms of their so what do you mean by like the materiality? Are you talking about
about, for example, that's why I want to compare these two, let's say, disciplines. It's like when I talk about the material, it's about, for example, in films, we have a huge industry. Like the question already start to be like at least not very illustrative, like if the camera, for example, from where is the copper or the lithium inside. I don't talk also about if the material aspect, like if we should produce again or project the films in teatro is a question, or still the idea of digitalize everything, like the material aspect of to make films is in question, or it's really not there yet, or it's not.
It's interesting because I would say the material aspect is precisely because there's like so much labor involved. There is this idea of like the money, like this is why I kind of don't mind film, and like I don't mind places like LA, because it's almost quite honest, because it's, you know, the sort of cutthroatness and the financial aspect is so prevalent because there's so much labor involved that you need money. Because there is this question of people who work in film, it's highly unionized. I mean, and it's interesting because it is one of these areas which is unionized, and it is like a lot of people who work in film are like forms of laborers, but it's not the same as like a traditional industries in many ways. But it is interesting that unions have sort of sustained themselves in that kind of small area that is kind of removed from like regular kind of industry. But those kinds of elements are like very on the surface, those kinds of like money related, like it's not it doesn't do a very good job at like mystifying that. But I feel like, I mean, I'm not that familiar, but I feel like an independent film, like smaller scale, because there's a crossover. I do some like experimental film, there's like a crossover between experimental film and like digital art and stuff, but like with like the grants-based stuff, it's more mystified where the value comes from, and you know, where value is being extracted and all this kind of stuff. But it's interesting because I don't feel like this question of, there is like a push, I guess, for people to create like zero carbon neutral movies, but I don't know whether that's just sort of been co-opted from kind of, you know, that green capitalism where you can continue getting away with the sort of atrocities of neoliberalism as long as you sort of like do the gestures, have the paper straws and the, you know, plant a tree or something in exchange for whatever you're doing. But in terms of the materiality, like the building of cameras and projection and stuff, because this is obviously something with digital art, it's much more ephemeral than that kind of like practical, you know, material based art.
Interesting how different. I just mentioned this because actually this kind of when sometimes we talk about creative industries or cultural industry, immediately we refer about cinema or TV actually. But that's why in the beginning I try to connect more with the idea how everyone somehow became a kind of this kind of creative, because also the idea of creativity also is all the time, even in advertising, like be creative, like this idea of how everyone have a kind of particularity and kind of, but this idea of creativity somehow became a really, I don't know, like a really important keyword in order to be successful and different, and this idea of multiculturality and so on. So of course it is a very clear definition about what is creative industry, at least for, I don't know, international institution. But I think the interest of, at least of this conversation, was really to I don't know, explore a bit more in different ways this idea of how also we became sometimes little industry, or I don't know, with our life, how, as you say, we deal with other people when we work in collectives, how is the working condition between us, also how to make a, let's say, a safe space for working too, about ethics. So it's very, very, very more
kind
big.
Of big,
so I hope at least in this short conversation we explore like very briefly, but it's very, I think it's very, very rich actually.
It's a very big topic, and I don't, in terms of because we were like, when when we're making films, I mean, I don't think, you know, one is very good. Like, you can have aspirations, but then there's obviously all kinds of things that get in the way. But I kind of think that the most important thing under capitalism is bringing to the surface of how it operates. So let's say the extraction of surplus value is the biggest kind of issue. So therefore, like, even more than, say, like having a collective, I think the most important thing is like paying people their value, which might be much above market rate or whatever sometimes. But yeah, but then how you would go out of business if you did that all the time. But and then obviously if you have a cooperative that relies on the neoliberal system existing outside of it and other people being exploited so that your company can do, yeah. So it's a really interesting one, and it's really, really difficult. But I also really like this idea of creativity as a sort of like identity category and a kind of really ideological thing. And as you say, like, I think it is really to do with the fourth industrial revolution and like the push of tech and freelance work and online work and digital work, and so much like social media is another creative medium where people are doing so much creative generation for free. Like that whole you know, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the way value is generated, well, partly it's to do with the fact that ideologically we've created this idea that this is a completely new and amazing productive thing, and they're actually losing loads of money. But anyway, or Twitter is, I don't know, I'm not like an economist, but in terms of Instagram, all of the value generation is done by, so the viewers view and they're being advertised to, so that's a way to extract surplus value. But like the labor of watching, but the labor of creation, yeah, and it's all this sort of like, you can be an online digital freelance. Of course you can't, you know. Yeah, anyway,
I think no, it's super huge because it's never ending actually. Like every year is something new, and this idea again who affect what, like, I don't know, sometimes I think also artists also affect somehow also the, like, to, it's like we bring more tools even, or and then the system have this feedback with us and somehow there. But anyway, that's why I like this invitation, because I think at least for me, if at least we're talking about that, we exchange in a collective way, at least we have somehow conscience about that. And the next week, the idea is to really talk. I will bring some kind of short feedbacks. I will try to really share, let's say, some notes about all this seminar. So the idea is really to finish, but not as a really have conclusions. It's really about to, you know, open the discussion for future talking. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Eduardo. Cheers. Great. So how do I end the recording? Let's just see. Here we go. That was great.